Dan Kish, who's the Vice President of Policy at the Institute for Energy Research. Welcome back to the Final Say radio show. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Brett. John?
Well, Dan, I was alluding to, I have one article which you wrote over the weekend, and I have another one which you were quoted in several times. Why don't we jump right into the response to the State of the Union, and thank you for sending this to me. This is from the Washington Free Beacon, entitled Drill Baby Drill by C.J. Ciamella from over the weekend as well. And now this is very interesting, and if you could get into this a little bit, it's the president made some specific quotations and references in the State of the Union, and this article really cleared up some of the issues with his statements. And being that you were so involved, please clear us up on what we were talking about here.
Sure. For those who watch the State of the Union, the president, among other things, called on a new spending program for energy, of all things. I guess we haven't been spending enough. But he said that we need to invest more in alternative forms of energy, and therefore he was proposing an energy trust fund, which was modeled after a proposal which he described as being put together by some retired admirals and generals and business people, and he told us that we should, follow this as an example. And the group is known as Securing America's Future Energy, and they did come out with a recommendation in December, and they said that such a trust should be established for purposes of funding alternative forms of energy. But what they also said in the report was that, and the funds ought to be derived because the government has not got enough of the federal lands open, from drilling offshore on the East Coast, West Coast, in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, as well as Alaska, plus opening areas like ANWR that Ronald Reagan first recommended after extensive study in 1986 for opening in Alaska, and that the new revenues that would be generated for the federal treasury, which would be enormous, could go into this fund to fund it. Unfortunately, upon checking on that, reporters have found from the White House that he has no intention whatsoever of generating the revenue. His real idea is to take existing revenues we get from ongoing energy production and use those instead. So it's a new spending program, not paid for, with anything new generating the revenue, and more of the same. So in essence, he chose to read or support part of the report that said, yes, we need to spend more money, and ignore the part that said, yes, we need to generate more energy, and from that will come the money.
Yeah, before John jumps in here, I want to just mention one thing from the article, and it says here that the Republicans and drilling advocates say that up to 85% of America's potential offshore oil remains off limits under this administration's plan.
Yes. Your listeners may recall that in 2008, when oil prices got very high, first President Bush, then a Democratic Congress led by Nancy Pelosi, dropped moratoria on the Outer Continental Shelf that had been in place beginning in 1981 for the East Coast, West Coast, eastern 45% of the Gulf of Mexico, and the vast preponderance of Alaskan offshore, which has never been really looked at, and whose offshore, by the way, is larger. Federal offshore area is larger than the entire continental outer continental shelf of the lower 48 states. So look along the coast of the United States out 200 miles, add that up. Following the coast of the United States, Alaska's is significantly larger than that and never been looked at. The in his plan for the next 5 years for allowing exploration and potential production of oil offshore, he goes back and reinstitutes, in essence, the moratoria that was lifted in 2008. And therefore, none of those new areas that everybody was screaming about when they were saying drill, baby, drill back in 2008 will be looked at for oil and gas production under his plan. So, in essence, he's put an administrative embargo on our own supplies on the 85% of the lower 48, and then basically they've ignored Alaska. They may allow some looking, but again, we've not looked at all in Alaska for oil, and many geologists who are familiar with Alaska believe that it could hold tremendous supplies of oil, larger, for example, in the offshore, in one particular area, the offshore, than the Gulf of Mexico.
Dan, putting the economics aside and looking at this purely from a national security asset perspective, what worries me is that we've seen storms like Katrina and Sandy, how quick and devastating they could be on infrastructure. And it seems like when we look at this 85% number, we have a high level of localized compression of these resources. So in other words, the fuel sources and the refining capacities are very much at risk of one very large natural disaster, hitting this nation. And if we don't have our energy resources spread out, West Coast, significant Alaskan, significant East Coast, as well as Gulf, so much is compressed in the Gulf right now that one major storm and this country is at enormous jeopardy. And there's no way that the slow increase in renewable resources could ever replace that extensive refining and drilling capacity. Can you speak to that, please?
Absolutely, and John, per usual, you're right on target. These are the sorts of things, to the extent that the federal government should be involved in making arguments about energy policy. These are the sorts of things that would be expected of an energy secretary who does his job. The idea that the Secretary of Interior, who oversees these lands and waters, would deliberately take a position that concentrates all of your oil and gas resource development and the accompanying infrastructure that's part of a massive industrial part of our country, and so essential to everything else, including our food production and all of our transportation, in one spot, which just happens to be Hurricane Alley, is the theater of the absurd. Frankly, it just doesn't make any sense, and therefore you'd seek, just as you should with fuel diversification, not necessarily to push things the way the government does, but to allow things to happen naturally that would happen but for government inattention to accessing these things. Sure, we ought to be the best way to do this is to have as many sources as possible in as many places as possible as the market will bear, which would benefit the economy regionally. It would lessen the likelihood that something catastrophic in one particular part of the country would affect everything else, and that just makes don't put all your eggs in one basket. So yes,
Dan, I'm sorry. The follow-up to that question is, so assume we have this 85%, and for the most part, it's offline because the government is blocking it. How much of those resources are going to be accessible either by some type of foolish contracts with other countries, or by other competitive countries like China, who are very aggressively targeting every resource they can get their hands on, to using advanced horizontal drilling techniques and things to sort of circumvent our restrictions on our accessible energy resources?
John, I didn't quite follow you there in terms of the. I guess you better run that by me again. Were you trying to?
Well, so to simplify it, yeah. So if we're blocking American companies and we're blocking drilling in these in 85% of our coastal regions, but we've learned that the American companies have accomplished great things by using horizontal drilling. So I'm wondering, with using techniques like that, can China circumvent our own restrictions to get access to the same fuel that we're blocking, either by use of technology or by use of international contracts, to gain both advantage and access to the resources that we're willfully blocking ourselves from making use of?
Got it. Okay. The answer would be. It's a good question, but the answer would probably be no, because there's little opportunity for getting at these resources. These are part of our territorial. This is part of our territorial sovereignty, the 200 nautical mile limit, which goes out and over which we have domain. So if the federal government says no to any leasing by anyone, then it would be extremely difficult for anyone to access them. Theoretically, they could do it from areas outside the 200-plus mile limit, but the conditions there, the Chinese aren't equipped yet to be able to do that sort of, we lead the world in the technology for deep and ultra-deep water drilling. And the limits of horizontal drilling are still pretty significant. I think the furthest they've gotten is at the extremis 6 or 7 miles, and that is really, really, really pushing the limit.
But Dan, before we let you go, I just want two quick points to raise here from an article from the Institute of Energy Research, and this is a great article, by the way, discussing the Interior prioritizing the renewable energy permits delaying oil and gas. And this was significant. That was pointed out at the very beginning, actually, and that was the capacity difference between what would happen on the oil and gas permits had they been given, as opposed to the government pet projects, and also the significant difference in job creation. I mean, you're talking right here, 500,000 new jobs a year and more than $30 billion a year in federal, state, and local tax revenue, which is just absolutely significant numbers.
Yeah, the Institute for Energy Research recently commissioned a study on the impact of, all of these new things. And the president announced today that he was going to streamline the permitting of alternative energy sources on government lands and waters, which is just a faster highway to hell in terms of consumers and competitiveness for the United States, because these sources are by their very nature uneconomic when compared to alternative sources. But we commissioned a look at with a professor who's head of the LSU Department of Economics, chair of the banking, and he also works at the Wharton School. Joe Mason.
Dr. Joseph Mason, yeah.
Yes. And what he found was that simply by allowing access to these areas, we're not talking about national parks and things like that. We're talking about simple areas that are expected to be part of that belong to every taxpayer who's paying too much for heating oil or gasoline or whatever, and that just unlocking the amount of resources that the government itself admits are there would lead to an immediate infusion of enormous amounts of both jobs and revenue into our economy, using the Bureau of Economic Analysis numbers, and in addition to the direct revenues we'd get from selling these leases and getting royalties off the top, which have fallen by half under this administration, they would lead to the additional benefits to the economy because, for those of you, I can tell you, I was out in North Dakota in the Bakken in October, and that area of the country is the most economically the economy is on fire out there. Anyone who wants a job can get a job, and they are good jobs. They're paying $15 or $17 for a job at McDonald's. They're building infrastructure, all of the things necessary for a modern economy as a consequence of shale oil development, all on private land, by the way. The government lands have not gone up accordingly. And this spreads throughout the economy. I mean, this is new wealth. It's right under our feet. All we have to do is produce it. We stop sending our money abroad. We add supplies of our own, which also reduces demand worldwide and theoretically should have a price impact there as well. And we all benefit, in the amount of revenue spun off to state, local, and federal government is just enormous, and as well as the jobs. I mean, over 37 years, the annual job production from such activity he estimates to be in the range of 2 million jobs per year. Not additional, not each year, but 2 million jobs sustained for from 7 to 37 years from now, and 500,000 over the short term, the first 7.
Yeah, it's essentially a 3 or 4 page jobs bill that does a heck of a lot more than this president has tried to do in the last 4 years.
Yeah, this isn't rocket science. We don't have to recreate the laws of thermodynamics. We use huge amounts of energy in this country. It's responsible for our economic growth. Every country that's growing in the world, all you have to do is take a look at the growth in their GDP and the growth in their energy consumption, and they track right alongside one another, and on the stream, basically a parallel line. We are at a different place in our development, but the fact is, affordable, abundant, reliable sources of energy that we create ourselves and receive the benefits of doing are great for this country. And it's as though they've forgotten that, and instead we're off chasing solar panels and windmills that produce electricity as much as 4.5 times as expensive as the stuff that we get now. And I tell you, for those places in this country that are doing this, and a lot of states are leading the way, and I think the Northeast is some of them, you're going to pay the piper. They're doing it in Europe. This stuff is not free. It's not cheap. No matter what you read, there's always some gimmick to it. If it were that way, people would be doing it without mandates and subsidies. And
that's a great point. Yeah, I was just saying that's a great point, what you just made. Dan, I want to thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no,
I want to thank you so much.
I love talking to you guys because we're talking good things.
No, that's right, and we do appreciate the great work that not just you, but all the people at the Institute for Energy Research are doing. That would be, by the way, instituteforenergyresearch.org. And please do check out Dan's articles and all the other fine work that you can find on their website. You could also sign up for a newsletter and updates. Again, Dan, thank you for joining us on the Final Say Radio Show.
Thank you, gentlemen.